Hello, everyone, and welcome into Coach Craig's Sports. This is my live stream for week one of the XFL. Going to be talking some XFL in general. Going to be talking some XFL DFS over on DraftKings. Talking through some of the pricings and first kind of look and go around, which is kind of what's going on with some of these XFL teams. Looking at the coaches, kind of looking at their past, kind of their tendencies, and what we can take away from it to get a little bit of an advantage, at least for week one, especially when it comes from a DFS perspective. I will probably be doing a more traditional DFS video or stream on Friday as well for the XFL DFS for week one. Hopefully we should have a little bit more news out by then at that point in time. But right now, just trying to go through some of these teams, making sure you guys are familiar with who's kind of on the team, their head coaches already talked about a little bit, the tendencies and everything else like that. This is my XFL DFS sheet. I'll probably share it for week one, but in the future, it'll be up on my Patreon page at patreon.com/CoachCraigSports. So if that's something you're interested in for future weeks, definitely be sure to check that out as well. But once again, if you're not familiar with the XFL, it's one of the alternative spring football leagues. There are 8 teams. We're going to be going through each one. We're going to start off with the Arlington Renegades. So the 3 quarterbacks that they do have on their roster, Kyle Slaughter, who was most recently with the USFL, played like one preseason game with the Jaguars this most current season in the preseason, and then ultimately ended up getting cut after that. They also have Drew Plitt behind him as well. He was the quarterback of Ball State for a short period of time. He came into, I believe, with the Browns as a camp arm, and then Kevin Anderson, who I believe was most recently in like the Fan Control Football League or the Spring League, one of those two. So I'm assuming that at this point in time, Kyle Slaughter is going to be the starter since he's kind of the one with the most experience. And then Drew Plitt, him and Slaughter kind of been in the competition, is most likely the backup. Anderson's probably going to be inactive most times on game day, assuming that most teams do not dress 3 quarterbacks for game day, since there are 6 inactive spots. So when we're talking through this Arlington team, we're going to go through the head coach first of all. After we talked about those quarterbacks, the head coach is Bob Stoops. Most famously, was the Oklahoma head coach for a long period of time, had a great record of success there. A guy that has kind of had a varying scheme of offenses over the years. Kind of likes to spread it out and run the ball at the same time. But then you're also talking about the 2 guys that they have in here as the offensive coordinators or co-offensive coordinators, and Jonathan Hayes and Chuck Long. If those names are familiar to you, if you watched the XFL in 2020, Jonathan Hayes was the Battlehawks head coach, and Chuck Long was one of the offensive coordinators, if not the only offensive coordinator for that Battlehawks team. Both guys played at Iowa back in the day. Bob Stoops was also on that team. So there's kind of that connection there way back when as well. So when you think about that Battlehawks team, they really wanted to run the ball a little bit more. So we'll see how this offense looks a little bit overall. Slaughter, more of a traditional pocket passer. So I think kind of the team that they have, you're looking more like a traditional pro style offense than kind of spread them out and run and gun like some of the other teams maybe in this league. And then for their defensive coordinators, Jay Hayes, who is the brother of Jonathan Hayes, was the Battlehawks defensive coordinator in 2020, obviously. And then Tim Lewis is the other one. He was the Gamblers defensive coordinator in the USFL season for 2022. So when you think about those 2 guys, they were very opportunistic defenses. So I would assume that this defense plays a similar type of way, which makes them pretty appealing when we talk about it from like a DFS perspective overall. Then we're going to get down to the 3 running backs that they do have on the roster at this point in time. I will note too, there is a reserve list, which is kind of like the injury reserve list, where a lot of teams have some player stash that are banged up at this point in time. We can probably go through some of them towards the tail end of this video as well, just since I have it on the other tab as well. But we got the 3 running backs that they do have. Kind of in my spreadsheet, I put the draft capital that these guys did have overall. So the guy that had the highest draft capital was actually Adrian Killens. He was a first-round pick. He was recently traded to the team back on February 8th, so about a week ago at this point in time. So he's more of that, kind of scab back, a little bit receiving, quicker back, everything else like that. But then the other 2 running backs they had, Keith Ford, they drafted in the 5th round. He was, I believe, on the Battlehawks team last time around as well, but wasn't too involved on that team overall. Got a little bit around here and there, but not too involved overall. And then Davion Smith, the other running back out of Michigan. He was the leading rusher in the XFL last time around. Most famously was cut in the USFL due to some conflicts or personal matters with the Maulers last season. So there's quite a variety of running backs here. Davion Smith's quite interesting when you talk about from a DFS perspective, $4,400. He was actually drafted in the 8th round of the supplemental draft, which not too high of praise for a guy that did lead the league in XFL or the XFL in rushing the last time around. So that is something to note there. Keith Ford, $6,800. Probably not a guy that I'm going after too highly myself, but a guy that is familiar with this offense overall, or the offense that you assume that Jonathan Hayes and Chuck Long would like to run. And then Adrian Killens, kind of that receiving back, $7,400, maybe a little bit heftier price than I like to pay for him overall, but the guy that can get some receptions and break off some long plays at that as well. Moving down to wide receivers that they do have on their team at this point in time. So they have Brandon Arconado, who is their 4th round pick in the obviously the XFL draft. Then we had Sean Moster, who was a guy that's played a lot in the CFL. He was a 1st round pick in the open phase, which is kind of like their version of free agency. Then we have Jordan Smallwood, 11th round pick, who obviously did play a little bit at Oklahoma, was in the XFL the first time around. Didn't do a whole heck of a lot in that though, but a bigger body, somebody that is somewhat athletic for a bigger body as well. Tyler Vaughns is somebody that's very interesting here. He played at USC. He was there with like Michael Pittman, Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's kind of like the 3rd guy there, but kind of a guy that I'm surprised isn't on an NFL roster at this point in time. He's only $3,000 for like week 1. So he is a very appealing pay down option. He's taken in the 10th round of the supplemental draft. And then we have Lawan Winnington, who had a pretty successful preseason with the Jaguars, but ultimately didn't end up making the team. He was drafted in the 3rd round of the actual XFL draft. So some pretty good wide receivers here when you talk about it. So we got guys that have decent draft capital. When we're talking from an XFL draft perspective, we had Winningham and Arconado. Arconado is $4,700, Winningham $6,300, Moster's $9,100 coming over from the CFL. Jordan Smallwood, kind of a bigger body, and then Tyler Vaughn's the flat minimum there. So when you're talking about a perspective like this, when we're talking about DFS perspective, a lot of these teams, we don't know exactly how they're going to line up. We did get a depth chart for like the Orlando Guardians. Hopefully we have a bigger depth chart for some of these other teams by the time we get to lock. But once again, that's why I'm going to be doing a little bit more DFS focused stream on Friday. This is just more talking through the players, talking through a little bit of the pricing from the first look perspective. But I think for me personally, when I'm looking at this team, the guys I'm probably going to have the most exposure to, maybe a Winningham, and then probably Tyler Vaughns, just because he's $3,000. So if you want to take shots on any of the other wide receivers, you're more than welcome to do so. We get down to tight ends, and Sal Cannell is going to be the first guy that you talk about, just because he has that previous connection with Kyle Slaughter in the NFL, or not in the NFL, in the USFL, excuse me. So right off the bat, he was one of the most successful tight ends over in the USFL. He gets his quarterback coming over with him. Here's the first pick they took in the draft, which says a lot when you're going after tight end. But when Jonathan Hayes is one of your co-offensive coordinators who played tight end in the NFL, longtime tight ends coach for the Cincinnati Bengals, not a major shock there. Then behind him, they have Sean Byer, who's $3,400. He's a tight end out of Iowa. Stuck on a couple of practice squads for a little bit during the season, but hasn't really done too much else. Alex Alice. And then they have Alex Ellis, who's $2,800, was in the 8th round. So, and then Nate Becker's there too, but he's not on DraftKings this week. So could be pretty interesting to see how this team shakes out overall. Definitely excited for it. But when we're talking from a DFS perspective, Kyle Slaughter is definitely in play unless we get news that he's not the starter for some reason. Davion Smith would be my favorite running back of the trio that they do have here. Killens, you can definitely take some shots in kind of their receiving game and everything else like that. But once again, he's only been with the team for a week. Then we have Tyler Vaughn's, probably my favorite pay down option at the wide receiver position. I don't mind going to Sal Cannell, especially in GPPs this week overall. For their Renegades defense, they are led on, they're a pretty decent defense on paper. They're led by Donald Payne, who was one of the top tacklers in the USFL. He was also a guy that played for Tim Lewis in the USFL, and I like their secondary as well. So they're $4,800, so they're one of the most expensive defenses this week overall. And when you're talking about week 1, we don't really know what these offenses are going to be. Defenses are probably going to be a little bit ahead of the offenses at this point in time. So I don't really particularly feel like paying up, but there is that chance there with the opportunities that they could have, especially when they're coached by 2 guys that are kind of opportunistic. So then we're going to get down to the DC defenders, and we're going to just go through the head coaches first. I kind of messed up the order the first time around and started talking about the quarterbacks, but the head coach for the DC defenders is Reggie Barlow. He played wide receiver in the NFL. he has actually been a head coach before. He was a head coach at Alabama State and Virginia State before. So he's a guy which some of these other coaches don't have quite that much experience, but he does have that head coaching experience. So that may give him a little bit of edge overall. Their offensive coordinator is Fred Caius. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but he's a college offensive coordinator for quite some time, and he was with Barlow at Alabama State. They in the past have liked having mobile quarterbacks, so it's no surprise that they have three very mobile quarterbacks on this roster. Greg Williams is the defensive coordinator. Obviously, if you're watching this, you're probably familiar with Greg Williams, the defensive coordinator. He used to be the Saints defensive coordinator, the Jets. He's been around the league for quite some time, interim head coach for the Browns. Obviously, there was the whole bounty gate and everything else like that, but bringing a guy like that who has the experience that he does and is going to add some tenacity to this defense, definitely going to make them a defense that's going to look pretty good overall. When we talk about the quarterback perspective, we have Jordan Ta'amu here at $9,600. He's likely the starter for this team. He has a lot of experience in these spring leagues overall, so not surprised by any means that they brought him in. They have Derek King and Eric Dungy behind them, both two very mobile quarterbacks, two guys that could actually play other positions. Derek King actually played with some wide receiver in college. It was kind of getting some looks from the NFL as a wide receiver, but it sounded like he really preferred on playing quarterback. So that's kind of why he really hasn't been on too many NFL rosters at this point in time. When we move down to the running back perspective, they have a very loaded running back room here. They have Abram Smith, who was the first overall pick in this most recent XFL draft. So he had like 1,600 yards rushing at Baylor. He was actually played a little bit of linebacker there as well. Very big bruising power back. Would expect him to kind of be the lead back in this committee. Not the greatest one in terms of receptions or anything else like that. But behind him, they have Raquel Armstead, who is a 6th round pick. And obviously, if you are familiar with the NFL, Raquel Armstead is a name that you've probably seen in the past at some point in time. Obviously, COVID kind of knocked out his NFL career, but a very capable backup running back, if that, or a guy that factors into this committee overall. I think you can definitely take shots on both them this week in DFS. Artavius Pierce as a third running back is a very good third running back too. He had some pretty good success at Oregon State. He had a little bit of run with the Bears here and there, but nothing too crazy there as well. Puka Williams technically is listed as a running back on their roster on the XFL website, but he's listed at wide receiver on DraftKings. He's $4,300. A guy that can do a little bit of both. He was a very effective running back at Kansas, but a little bit undersized guy, probably fits in a little bit better in the slots. So kind of a versatile piece that they're probably going to look to use in a lot of different ways. He was a 7th round pick in the XFL draft. So not a guy that you would shy away from playing this week overall, honestly. Then when we talk about the other wide receivers they have in here, we got Chris Blair, who is $3,000. He's been on some NFL practice squads, but nothing special. I'm not expecting too much from him. Jaquiz Azard, who was their 2nd round pick. He's $7,300. Definitely a guy that you can take a shot on if you're trying to pair somebody with Jordan Ta'amu this week. Josh Hammond bounced around the NFL a little bit, so he was a 9th round pick for them, $6,200. Do not mind him whatsoever. Chad Hansen, who was a guy that was a 4th round pick in the NFL. He bounced around a little bit with the Jets, the Texans, and a couple other teams. He had some, as a Texans fan, I saw him actually have some decent run down the stretch and was even a viable fantasy option down the stretch. What was that, like 2 years ago now? So at $3,700, I think he's a viable pay down option. He's a guy that can play on the outside, can play on in the inside, in the slot as well. So they have some pretty good receiving options here, especially with Lazard, Hammond, Hansen, Puka Williams, if they're deploying him in that method. And then they do have Lucky Jackson here at $4,900, 11th round pick in the XFL draft. He is a CFL guy. Played at Western Kentucky before that, had some success in the CFL, so it would be interesting to see if that success translates over to the XFL as well and how they kind of use them. They do have some options here too in the kick and punt return game as well, with a Puka Williams, with Lucky Jackson, guys like that as well. And then Josh Malone was a guy that bounced around the NFL for a little bit of time too, so $3,000 is not a bad price for him week 1. When we talk about these tight ends, they really are more blocking tight ends. Ethan Wolf, was on some practice squads. He's an 8th round pick, primarily known as a blocking tight end. Trey Berry, blocking tight end. Really Moore is a blocking tight end, but he's a guy that did show a little bit of promise at Kansas State too after the catch too. So at $4,400, if you really want to take a shot on him, you can definitely do that. Ta'amu's favorite target in the USFL was kind of his tight end as well. So maybe we get a little bit of that once again. And then even going back to the offensive coordinator, and the offensive coordinator, Reggie Barlow, when their time at Alabama State, they did like to run the ball quite a bit. So I would not be surprised if they lean heavily on the running game, lean heavily on the mobile quarterback, and then kind of deploy multiple tight end sets, use the tight ends in the play action passing game, and then kind of spread it out wide when they need to do so. From the Defenders defense, they're $3,500. They are a group that's led by their defensive line and linebackers. Wasn't like overly impressed with their secondary, but Greg Williams' defense, they're going to be, a little bit tenacious and get after the quarterback. But that's kind of what I have for the Defenders. We're moving down to the Houston Roughnecks right now, which is going to be a very interesting team overall. They are coached by head coach Wade Phillips. Obviously, if you've been around football for long enough, you know who Wade Phillips is, son of Bum Phillips, who was the former Houston Oilers head coach, who was defensive coordinator under Ditko with the Bears and all that. But Wade Phillips, he's up there in age at this point in time. He's been a long-term defensive coordinator in the NFL. He's had some head coaching stints as well. Never been a guy to shy away from, talking to anybody. A great guy overall as well. He brings in offensive coordinator AJ Smith with him. He's kind of like a June Jones prodigy. He was an offensive coordinator in the TSL. He worked under June Jones, I believe, the last time around in the XFL as well. So you're probably looking at some more run and shoot offense in here. Brian Stewart comes over as the defensive coordinator. He was most recently the defensive coordinator at Maryland in 2001. A little bit older guy as well, but expect him and Wade Phillips kind of pair up on this defense, probably running some type of 3-4 defense as Wade Phillips typically does. When we talk about the quarterbacks position for this Houston Roughnecks team, this is going to be a very interesting one to, for this week, especially because we have three guys here. Brandon Silvers, who was with Seattle the last time around in the XFL, he was a decent quarterback there at that. Nothing too special, but $8,200 was not a bad price for him from DFS perspective if he ends up starting. Cole McDonald's kind of the guy here to mention. He was a Hawaii quarterback. He is a very mobile quarterback, which makes him very, very appealing if he starts, and he's only $6,000. Caleb Elby, Western Michigan quarterback, kind of a developmental guy, is kind of the third guy in this mix as well. Would not be surprised if we see all three at some point this season. When it comes to the running back position, we have Bryson Allen, who is $3,000 flat minimum. He's 11th round XFL draft pick for them, so he's kind of in play here. We're not really sure what we're going to get out of this backfield, but assuming run and shoot, they're really going to want running backs that can catch the ball out of the backfield. So Max Borghi's probably going to be the guy that they lean on the most. He's $4,500. He played at Washington State. He caught a ton of balls there. Obviously played for the late great Mike Leach as well. Was a 6th round pick here. I think that was really good value as well for somebody of his talent, somebody that a lot of people thought would end up on, like an NFL team, NFL practice squad at the very least. So look for him to kind of be a star player, and $4,500 definitely makes him a great cash game play this week overall, especially if he's kind of lead back and getting those receptions. DeJuan Lee is kind of $6,400. He's not a guy that I'm going after particularly myself, just because we don't know how this backfield is going to shake out. And with the other cheaper options there overall, it's just kind of hard to get to him. We have Nick Holly, who is listed at running back for $3,000. He had played some wide receiver the last time around in the XFL, so he's familiar with AJ Smith. Would not be surprised if he's, pretty active in this passing game overall. When we get down to our wide receivers here, we have Dante Burnett, who played at USC, $7,900. Was a 4th round pick for this Houston team. Expect him to be one of the starting wide receivers. Cedric Bird out of Hawaii, if Cole McDonald ends up starting, could be a guy that he leans on. He was a 3rd round pick for them, $5,300 overall. Definitely in play. Davion Davis is $3,000. He's a guy that spent some time with the Houston Texans practice squad, so I would not be surprised if he gets involved here. And then we have Travell Harris, $6,600. If you want to lean on him, you can go there. They got a lot of guys here that you could take a look at, especially since they have so many wide receivers. And when you see the draft capital that they put in these guys, Bird's a 3rd round pick, Burnett's a 4th round pick, Justin Smith went in the 5th round, Kirkland went in the 7th round, Aaron Nelson went in the 8th round. So pretty much on these teams that have these run and shoot offenses, both teams that are running that scheme in this league, they have 8 wide receivers. They're going to have 3 or 4 guys out there on the field at most times. So do not be afraid to shy away from some of these guys overall. Not going to go too far in depth there, but Aaron Nelson would be a guy I like to take a shot on, as well as Davion Davis, since both had a cup of tea in the NFL as well. Then we have Garrett Owens, $3,900, versatile tight end. He can catch the ball, he can run the ball, just do a little bit of everything as well. He is a 2nd round pick, so they're highly invested in him. So we'll see if he plays a major role in this offense or not. The Roughnecks defense, though, $3,000. We're talking about a Wade Phillips coach defense. Brian Stewart's here too. They're a very experienced and well-rounded defense for this XFL. So I do expect that experience to really, really pay off overall. And that's going to be something that's really impressive week one. And at the flat minimum, or the lowest price defense on the slate, I think they're one that's going to be very, very appealing for cash games, especially since all these games are lower scoring anyway. So even if they gave up 17 points, it's not the end of the world. But I do like the defense that they have put together overall. Then we get down to the Orlando team, which is led by Terrell Buckley, who is a head coach. He is a former DB. He's mainly coached defensive backs at the college level in the past. So not what you expect from a head coach, but there's a lot of guys like that in this league overall. And then we have Robert Ford is the offensive coordinator. He's an older gentleman, and he has a lot of experience coaching wide receivers and tight ends at the NFL level. Not really sure what their scheme will look like at this point in time. I would expect a little bit more traditional offense. Their depth chart did come out, and it was listing 2 tight ends. So I would assume that, it's a more old school offense. They want to run the ball a little bit more. And when they first kind of put their team together, I thought it was going to be more of an RPO heavy offense, but the more I'm doing research into it, maybe a little bit more old school. Tony Carter, he's the defensive coordinator. He's mainly coached cornerbacks at the college level, and he was a defensive back himself at the NFL level. So a relatively young, unexperienced staff put together. I guess Ford is a little bit older, but not a guys that have a lot of play calling experience, and not a guys that have a lot of head coaching experience at the same time. So when we talk about their depth chart, since we did see their depth chart at this point in time, we had the quarterback situation. We have Paxton Lynch, who just signed with the team, back at the end of January. He's likely the starter at this point in time, but on their depth chart, they put Paxton Lynch first, then DeAndre Francois, then Dormandy, but they have an or between all of them. So Paxton Lynch, $8,900. DeAndre Francois is Paxton Lynch, $8,900. Francois, $8,100. Dormandy, $6,400. So I wouldn't be surprised if all 3 of these guys end up playing at some point during this game. Paxton Lynch, probably the most talented of them. I think he gets the first shot. Francois is a little bit better runner than him. So there is some pretty good upside there. Maybe we get a clear-cut starter by the time we do get to lock, especially from a DFS perspective, but a very interesting group altogether. And before they brought Paxton Lynch in, I thought this was the weakest quarterback room, but it's getting up there. It's not as good as some of the other ones, but it's not as bad as it was initially, at least. From the running back perspective, they only have 2 guys on this team, which sounds a little bit weird when you're thinking of a team that's a little bit more old school running. Jermaine Martin is going to be the main guy. He was a 5th round pick in the XFL draft. He is one of my favorites for cash game play this week, $7,100. A guy that is going to get a pretty heavy workload. He's like 5'10", 220 pounds is what he was kind of listed at in college. So a guy that can definitely handle that workload. And then we have Devin Darrington, $3,500, 7th round pick by the team, more of a receiving back. So would expect him to kind of be the change of pace back in the system overall. But you can definitely play both guys this week, especially from the DFS perspective when you have only 2 running backs in this team overall. We get down to the wide receivers, and the most interesting thing at the wide receiver position was when the depth chart came out is that Cody Lattimore, who has played in the NFL before. He was 11th round XFL draft pick from them. He's only 3,000 flat minimum on the wide receiver spot, is listed as tight end on the depth chart and one of the starting 2 tight ends. So I think he's a very interesting play there. We saw a guy like Sage Surratt make that transition last year in the USFL, going from wide receiver to tight end. He had his moments, so Lattimore could do as well. He had some moments in the NFL too as well. He had a whole bunch of other issues that kind of threw him out of the league, if you want to say it as that. So would be interesting to see kind of how he develops overall. Their 1st round pick was Charleston Rambo, who was a wide receiver for Oklahoma. He didn't do too much there. Then he transferred to Miami for his final season. Played pretty well there, went undrafted. Got a cup of tea, in the preseason with the Panthers, but ultimately ended up getting cut, not really sticking on any practice squads. Was a top, like 5 pick in this XFL draft. So I do think that they're going to lean on him pretty well. Stephen Goodry behind him at $6,900. Both these guys were listed as the starter at this point in time on that unofficial depth chart that we did get out by the Guardians overall. He was their third round pick. Do expect him to play a pretty good role. He's a guy that I have a lot of interest in, especially from a DFS perspective. He's only $6,900. I think he has a skill set that's able to do a lot of different things, especially knowing the fact that he is one of the starters. And then we have Andrew Jamel, who is a second round pick for them. They really lean heavily on that wide receivers to start. He'll probably be kind of like their slot wide receiver when they go to 3 wide receivers. Javonta Payton and Dontrez Bird are both on the team as well. Bird would be probably the one that I'm more interested out of those two overall. And then they do have, excuse me, I'm cutting off there a little just bit because they do have Eli Rogers. They took in the first round of the supplemental draft. He had a couple decent seasons with the Steelers, but he's getting up there in age. So he's another slot guy that could mix in with Jamel as well. And then they got Dedrick Thomas, who they just brought in, and I believe a little bit later as well. He's the flat minimum. We'll see if he gets worked in or not. When it comes to the tight end perspective, yeah, Ryan Becker and Logan Carter. Both guys are really cheap. Becker, they spent a 4th-round pick on, so he'll probably be a little bit more important to their team. But, the fact that they moved Lattimore to tight end is kind of interesting, too, since they listed 2 tight ends on their depth chart, even though they only really had 3 if you count Lattimore overall. The Guardians defense, $3,400 from a DraftKings perspective. Their younger defense, I thought they were going to be led by Tigray Scales and Matt Elam. Matt Elam's starting, but Tigray Scales is actually listed as a backup, which is just kind of interesting since he's a guy that's had a lot of success in these spring leagues overall. But the younger defense coordinator, I would not be surprised to see if they struggle right off the bat. So they're kind of one that I'm avoiding in week 1, especially from a DFS perspective. Then we're going to get down to San Antonio, who their head coach is Hines Ward. Obviously, the Steelers wide receiver, I don't believe he's in the Hall of Fame at this point in time. He's definitely kind of up there in that category where he warrants the discussion if he's not. So he's a guy that really doesn't have like a lot of head coaching experience. He's had, some assistant coaching where he's been coaching wide receivers, but kind of getting that first crack at being a head coach in the XFL. Pretty interesting there overall. The offensive coordinator is Jamie Oslando. I'm probably mispronouncing his name there. I do apologize for that. But he was the Vipers offensive coordinator in 2020. They were a team that were a little bit more run heavy as well. He did I can't even say for sure that they liked a bigger quarterback because they had Taylor Cornelius there. They had Brandon Flowers as well, but Flowers is kind of jack of all trades guy. But that bigger quarterback, they have named Jack Cohen the starter. So we'll see what he does. He's the former Wisconsin quarterback, former Notre Dame quarterback. Wasn't really too impressed with him in college, but wouldn't be surprised if one of these other quarterbacks does mix in a little bit. I was kind of shocked that Reed Sennett was not named the starter. I think he has a little bit more upside than a guy like Jack Cohen. But Jawan Pass is a little bit more athletic, so maybe he's active on game days as the backup. Maybe they carry 3 quarterbacks, and maybe they use him in some packages as well. And then their defensive coordinator, Jim Herman, was the Guardians defensive coordinator in 2020. And they had a pretty solid defense, so I would expect this defense to be pretty good overall. When you talk running back perspective, we have Jaquez Patrick here. He's $7,800 on the DFS site for this week. He was their first-round pick. He obviously has familiarity in this offense with their offensive coordinator since he was the Vipers running back in 2020 and was pretty good there, so would expect him to be pretty good overall. Kalen Balaj, they took in the 6th round. Obviously had a pretty good college career. Didn't really do too much at the NFL level, but a name that is pretty familiar. Would not be surprised if he kind of, makes a name here at the XFL level, $4,800. Definitely worth playing in some GPPs this week overall. Then John Hillman, $3,400. Would you expect him to kind of be like that receiving back, change of pace back since, Balaj and Patrick, a little bit bigger grinder backs at this point in time. Then we move down to their wide receivers. I'm going to get a drink here real quick. So their wide receiver room is kind of an interesting one overall. It's really led by Jalen Tolliver, who's had some pretty good success in the XFL in the past. Was a 4th-round draft pick by them. He's $7,400. Looks like a decent cash play at this point in time. I know I'm going to just pop this coming up here because I know Evan was here before, and he said DFS plays at his finest. Yeah, so XFL DFS, especially week 1, is going to be a tricky bag. But like I already said, Friday I'll be doing a little bit more with that as well, kind of talking more in depth from these teams, kind of who I would play, whether I would play them in cash or GPP. Like I said, I'm going to put this sheet up at this point in time for this week. For future weeks, it'll be on my Patreon at patreon.com/CoachCraigSports. But back to these receivers real quick. So On the outside, you would assume that Jalen Tolliver is going to be one of the starters on the outside. TJ Vasher is probably the most likely guy on the opposite side. He was a 9th-round draft pick for them. Bigger, like 6'5", 6'6" wide receiver out of Texas Tech. Had like one really good year there, but kind of a slow mover, so didn't really amount to much at the NFL level. Would not be a guy, I wouldn't be surprised if he ultimately ends up converting to tight end, but he'd obviously have to put on a little bit of weight because he's kind of a stick at this point in time. But he could be a guy that kind of shines in this league, maybe like a Jonathan Adams Jr. did in the USFL. And then kind of the rest of the guys here shaking out. They got Landon Akers at $8,200. I believe he was an open phase or supplemental pick that was pretty high up there as well. Probably a slot guy for them overall. A little bit of time in the NFL for him. Fred Brown, Travis Johnson, and Darius Roberson Jr. Kind of just guys that are probably depth at this point in time, lest we see otherwise, but they are cheap price tags. So if you really want to take a shot on them from a DFS perspective, you can do it. Roberson was traded to the team back on the 24th of January, so he hasn't been around as long. Then we move down to the tight ends. They have 4 of them on their team, which is kind of interesting. We got Ben BC, who is a 13th round supplemental pick. He was traded to the team. I think they want to use him more like a fullback, so I probably would avoid him at this point in time when it comes from DFS perspective. Alize Mack is $3,600, 7th-round pick for them. Wouldn't mind him in like GPPs. Pettigrew is probably another blocker. Deion Yelder is a guy that's been around the NFL for a while. Been on a couple of different teams. Somewhat athletic tight end, decent blocker, 13th-round supplemental pick for them. Wouldn't be surprised if he has an important role for this team. Not sure it's going to be week 1 or not, but if you want to take a chance on that, you could definitely do that. And then for their defense, they're $3,200 for week 1. Their younger defense, they might be a little bit hit or miss early on, but with their defense coordinator and Jim Herman, I think they'll ultimately come around. Not sure you want to play them week 1, but they are one of the cheaper ones. So if you want to take that shot, you can definitely do that. We move down to the Seattle Sea Dragons now, who are coached by Jim Haslett, who is a longtime coach in the NFL level. He was most notably the Saints head coach, was a defense coordinator for before that. So I do expect this team to be pretty well coached overall. Their offensive coordinator is June Jones, who's been around for seems like forever. He was the head coach for the Houston Roughnecks the last time around. He is going to be a run and shoot offense overall. So a lot of a lot of passing, some running draws, everything else like that. There's probably going to be 3-4 wide receivers on the field more often than not, sometimes even 5. So want to attack some of the wide receivers in this offense overall. Then defensive coordinator is Ron Zook, who has a long history of defensive coordinator and head coach kind of in the NFL and college level. He was the head coach for Illinois and Florida. So those are probably his 2 most notable stops, but definitely a lot of experience on this coaching staff that Jim Haslett has assembled. So I think this is going to be one of the teams that is pretty well coached and probably going to come out of the gate strong, at least to start the year. When it comes to the quarterback position, we have 3 quarterbacks here. Ben DiNucci, $9,800, probably a familiar name for some people watching since he did start a couple games for the Cowboys at the NFL level. Wasn't too great there, but had a pretty successful career at James Madison before that. Could be very effective if he is named the starter. Steve Montez played at Colorado. Not a guy that I'm super fond of. Harrison Frost is also there, probably the 3rd guy at this point in time. Has played in a couple other leagues, but I'm not too excited about him. It seems like DiNucci's probably the guy at this point in time. And if he's the guy all alone week 1, $9,800 is going to look like a pretty decent price tag for a run and shoot offense overall. Their running backs are kind of led by TJ Hammonds and Brendan Knox. TJ Hammonds, $7,500, was drafted in the 2nd round by this team overall. He's probably going to be their pass catching back. Brendan Knox, I would assume, would be more the power back, the traditional back. Was drafted in the 5th round by them. He's $5,500. So if you want to take a shot on him week 1, I don't mind that. Morgan Ellison, I would just assume would be kind of that 3rd back. Probably doesn't get as much run as the other 2 guys. Since we're talking about the run and shoot offense, the wide receivers are going to be pretty important overall. And once again, 8 wide receivers on this team overall. So we got Josh Gordon. He's the most notable name on this list. He was a 6th round supplemental pick, which probably most XFL teams didn't think he'd show up if they actually drafted him. So maybe that's why he went at that point in time. But $9,000, we know what he could potentially do in this league, and it's kind of scary. So he's probably going to be a very popular player week 1. Juwan Green behind him at $7,100 was drafted in the 3rd round of the XFL draft Played his college ball at Albany. He was on the Falcons practice squad for a little bit over the last 2 years. Pretty good speed guy as well. So I would be pretty interested in him hooking up with DiNucci if you're trying to do that stack. Blake Jackson's lower school guy, not too much else to say there. Blake McKnight's kind of in that range too as well. Those are two guys that I'm not as interested in. Jakeer Pearson, $6,100 was their 4th round pick. Played a little bit, I believe, at Ole Miss. So he is kind of interesting as well. Then kind of these other guys here that are a little bit cheaper are the ones that I'm most interested in. Jalen Reed, former Oregon wide receiver, $3,000 is a pay down option. He was drafted in the 11th round by the Seattle team. Jordan VC was an 8th round supplemental pick. He's bounced around the NFL practice squad. So if he gets a chance, he could be very interesting. And flat minimum week 1, definitely like him. And Damian Wallace got a little bit of cup of tea in the NFL, was a 6th round pick. Do like his skill set potentially in this offense at $3,000 week 1 is very appealing. And then we have Charlie Tempompoa. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but it sounds like he's going to be more of a fullback than a tight end. But 14th round supplemental pick. He was traded to the team, a couple weeks back. So we'll see how they use his role overall. Then for the Seattle Sea Dragons defense, they're $4,200. So they're one of the most expensive ones week 1, but I expect them to be pretty well coached between Jim Haslett and Ron Zook. So I wouldn't be surprised if they came out and played really well week 1. They're a pretty decent defense. They're led by their defensive line and secondary at this point in time. Then we move down to the Battlehawks, who are coached by Anthony Beck, former Jets tight end, Doesn't have a whole ton of coaching experience. He coached some tight ends in the AAF, so that's pretty much what he's got at this point in time. This is a pretty young, unexperienced coaching staff at this point in time. Bruce Gradkowski is actually the offensive coordinator. After his playing days, he worked a little bit for PFF. He's mainly been a head coach at the high school level. So we'll see what this offense looks like overall. I would expect maybe it to be a little bit more creative offense overall, but then you also add in kind of the traditional tight end factor that Anthony Beck might have on this team as well. So not really sure what it's going to look like at this point in time. Donnie Abraham is the defensive coordinator. He has mainly coached in high school and then done a little bit with DBs and then was a DB coach in the AAF. So we'll see what this team looks like, especially from that coaching perspective overall, just because these guys don't have a ton of experience, especially at a higher level. Then we're going to get over to the quarterbacks. They're led by AJ McCarron, $10,500 week 1 for DFS. He is relatively safe just because we know he's the starter, and there's not too many guys that we know are the starter for sure. Nick Tiano is behind him. He's $7,000, most likely the backup week 1, a little bit more athletic. And then Manny Wilkins is another athletic quarterback they added as their 3rd quarterback after Ryan Willis essentially requested his release and then joined or he's planning to join the USFL. I'm not sure if he's already joined yet or not. Then for the running back perspective, they drafted Mateo Durant out of Duke in the 4th round, $7,700, definitely in play this week. Brian Hill out of Wyoming, 6th round draft pick for them as well in that XFL draft, $5,800, a guy that's had some NFL experience. I kind of like Brian Hill this week overall. I think he's maybe a guy that's going to get more receptions than Mateo Durant, at least off the bat. Kareem Walker's also there, but I kind of expect him to be a 3rd fiddle among these running backs. When it comes to these wide receivers, they have an interesting group here. They have Marcel Aitman, who is at Oklahoma State, played with the Raiders a little bit at the NFL level. He's their 1st round pick. He's a very high draft pick, $9,200. So they would expect to feature him. Hakeem Butler out of Iowa State was the 5th round supplemental pick for them. He's $4,200 week 1. Guy that didn't really pan out at the NFL level. They tried converting him to tight end. Now it looks like he's trying to convert back to wide receiver. So we'll see what he is at this level. Could be, one of those guys that maybe shines at a lower level of competition. George Campbell's behind them, $7,700. If I'm being completely honest, don't know a ton about him at this point in time, but $7,700 at the bat. That's not really the guy I want to take my shot on. Gary Jennings had a cup of tea with the NFL, a little bit bigger body wide receiver. Wouldn't be surprised if he does well in this league. Stephen Mitchell Jr. is $6,400. He played at USC, he played a little bit with the Texans. Not being a Texans fan, seeing him play, not somebody that I'm particularly interested in, especially at $6,400. But now we're talking because we're getting down to the Austin Prohl at $3,000. I like him a lot this week as a pay down option. Figure he's going to be the slot wide receiver. His dad, Ricky Prohl, is actually the wide receivers coach here too. So that might have a little bit of influence on things, but he played pretty well with Seattle last time around. Would expect him to be their slot wide receiver. Would expect Marcel Aitman to start on the outside. And then them kind of, shuffle through some other guys, whether it's like a Hakeem Butler, George Campbell, Gary Jennings, Stephen Mitchell, and even Darius Shepard, who's listed here as well. $4,500 was a 5th round pick by the team. He played his college ball at North Dakota State, had a little bit of a run with the Packers, mainly as a kick returner, but wasn't that great. Played in the USFL for the New Jersey Generals. He had like 1 or 2 good games with them, but that was about it. Then we get down in these tight ends, and they drafted some pretty athletic tight ends with Giovanni Haskins, who was out of Rutgers in the 10th round. Do like him kind of as a pay down option this week if you want to go there. Sutherland's probably the guy that I'm not paying too much attention to. And then Jordan Thomas, who did have some success at the NFL level. It seemed like he was ultimately getting cut and picked up by a team every couple of weeks, but he's a guy that I liked a lot, especially when he was with the Texans. If he's one of those guys, he's a little bit bigger body, carries a little bit heavier weight, but if he keeps his weight under control, he's pretty athletic for his size overall. It could really be a monster in this league. So definitely have some interest in him once again. Then when we talk about the Battlehawks DST, $4,500 week 1, probably not a team that I'm going to get a lot of. They have a strong defensive line, and they're pretty young at linebacker. And in the secondary, they're coached by a defensive coordinator that hasn't had too much experience. So probably a team that I'm going to fade a little bit more, especially week 1 from a DFS perspective. Then lastly, we get down to the Vegas Vipers, who are led by head coach Rod Woodson. Obviously, he was a very famous defensive back in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, mainly as coach defensive backs, whether it's been at the NFL level, college level, stuff like that. Their offensive coordinator is Dwayne Taylor. He's been a college offensive coordinator, most notably at Alabama A&M, where he coached Akil Glass, who is kind of known as a NFL prospect, ultimately ended up in the USFL now. Thought maybe he'd come over with him, but did not. And then Chris Dishman is their defensive coordinator. He's been around the block for a little while, and he was the defensive coordinator for the New Jersey Generals, who had a pretty decent defense, a little bit of an opportunistic defense at that as well. When we talk about the Vipers quarterback situation, we have Brett Hundley here. Played his college ball at UCLA, had a couple starts with the Packers, backing up Aaron Rodgers when he was hurt, bounced around the NFL a little bit. I think he's probably one of the more talented quarterbacks in this league, so I would not be surprised if he gets to start. Ultimately, might not, just because he signed with the team recently. He's only been around for about 2 weeks, so maybe he doesn't know fully the offense, but would expect him to be the starter at some point in time. Luis Perez is kind of the other guy here at $7,700. He is a guy that's been around pretty much every spring football league, whether it's the AAF, the USFL, the XFL. He's been around them all. Pretty experienced guy. You know what you're getting with him. He's not going to kill you on any given slate, in any given game, anything else like that. And then behind him is Jalen McClendon, who's, I assume, the 3rd quarterback at this point in time. Kind of a raw guy that's been in some of these spring leagues before, but really hasn't done too much. Then we move down to running back, where they have John Levitt, who they took in the 2nd round. He's $7,200. Rod Smith, more of a whole fullback at the NFL level. So we'll see how they plan to use him, whether it's at fullback or just kind of like a goal line back. And then they have DeAndre Torrey, who is a 9th round pick by them, $5,200. I like his upside. I believe he played at North Texas, was used a little bit in the return game as well, can catch the ball. So he's kind of interesting. They also do have Brian Burt, who I believe was recently joined the team. He's listed as kind of running back on their roster. He's not on DraftKings at this point in time. Sounds like he could play a little bit of wide receiver as well. Dwayne Taylor is a guy that has been known to like to use these multiple position guys at times. So maybe he's a guy that he falls in love with at some point in time. From the wide receiver perspective, they are led by Martavis Bryant, who was their 1st round pick, obviously played in the NFL for the Steelers, for the Raiders for a point in time. Obviously, most people know why he wasn't in the NFL at any point in time. He failed a couple drug tests, so kind of bounced around. I believe he tried playing in the FCF or the Fan Control League as well. So we'll see what he has left in the tank, but he's a very interesting play week 1. Obviously, they're pretty invested in him. And then their second wide receiver is probably going to end up being Jeff Badette, who is a little too expensive for me week 1 at $8,500. He was the 6th round pick for them. So we'll see what it looks like. He's better off as a slot guy, though, but he does have really good speed. Obviously, we saw that at Oklahoma. We've seen it in the XFL. We've seen it in the USFL. He even got in a couple games with the Commanders, too, I believe, as well. Geronimo Allison's kind of another guy, $7,000. Maybe him and Brett Hundley have some chemistry that they can bring to the table. But he's a guy that can play on the outside. He can play on the inside. Wasn't anything super great at the NFL level, but he could be okay at the XFL level. $7,000, probably a little bit more than I'd like to pay. Then we have two other guys here with Matthew Sexton, $3,000. Had a pretty good preseason for the Steelers, I believe, either last year or the year prior. He's a guy that can also help in the kick return game, maybe a little bit more of a slot guy too. So him and Jeff Badette may be a little bit too similar. So if you want to take a shot on Sexton, pay down the option, he was an 8th round draft pick. Don't mind that. And then they have Sneak Sweeting, who I really just don't know too much about, so I don't feel comfortable playing him at this point in time. Might dig a little bit more into him so we have some more information come Friday. And then we move down to tight end. They have Brandon Dillon, who they took in the 3rd round. Had a cup of tea with the Vikings at one point in time. Pretty good blocker, could be used a little bit in the passing game. They have Travis Kuntz and Sean Price and Cam Sutton as well. But Sean Price was a 4th round draft pick. He was mainly used as a blocking tight end the last time around in the XFL. So we'd assume that this is kind of an offense that's more traditional offense overall. They want to run the ball to kind of start off with like John Lovett, maybe a little bit Rod Smith and Torrey as well. And then they'll go 3 wide when they need to do so because they have the options to do that with, moving Jeff Badette maybe in the slot if he's starting on the outside. Or maybe they just kind of open up with a couple other different players as well. That Vipers defense, I think they'll be a little bit hit or miss at this point in time. I wasn't overly impressed with the group that they assembled, but they're kind of led by their edge rushers at this point in time. I think Chris Dishman will have them kind of whipped up into shape as we get moving along with the season. $3,800, not any by them going out of my way particularly to play week 1, but I wouldn't blame you if you did. So before we get out of here, I'm going to go over the reserve list. So these are the guys that are kind of like on injury reserve at this point in time. So the Renegades have a trio of wide receivers with Flynn Nagel, who's kind of bounced around these leagues before, Cameron Brown, Ja'Cory Sullivan, who had some success at the college level. And then they have 2 tight ends with Isaac Noda, who was kind of bounced around the NFL. He was on the Packers practice squad for a little bit as well. And then Dominic Wood Anderson. So they could open up a little bit more there as well. They're a team that could potentially be pass happy. The defenders have Jazz Ferguson, who's kind of like that bigger, faster guy. He's been in these spring leagues before. He's had some success here and there, but he's always a guy that seems to get a little bit hurt as well. KD Cannon, who is a guy that had some pretty good success at Baylor, really hasn't done too much since then. So we'll talk about him a little bit later probably. And then Khalil Warren, who is a tight end, kind of thought of pretty well, but really hasn't done anything at the NFL level or, pretty much any level since getting out of college. The Roughnecks have Sui. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that last name. He's more of a fullback at this point in time. One of my favorite guys that is on the reserve list at this point in time is going to be Calvin Turner Jr. He played at Hawaii. He played some running back. He played some wide receiver there. He's a very versatile piece, and I think he's a guy that they're going to love once he is able to go. Not sure how long he's going to actually be out for, but once he's available, I think he's going to be a chess piece that they can use a lot. He even played a little bit of quarterback before transferring to Hawaii in college, so could be a very fun guy, especially with the double pass in the XFL. For the Sea Dragons, they have Kevin Cassis, who was on the Seahawks for a little while for their practice squad. Josh Perkins is another tight end for them since they really only have Charlie. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name once again, who is more of a fullback anyways. And then for the Battlehawks, they have Hakizin Grimsley and Jalen Smith. Jalen Smith's a athletic guy that they could potentially use in the future too as well. It seemed like I believe the Battlehawks were one of those teams that had all those athletic tight ends. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. But that's kind of what I wanted to talk about for today, doing, a little bit of a preview for the XFL in general, going through some of the teams, the guys that are on these rosters, breaking down, talking a little bit about their head coaches, how these schemes might, kind of work out all together. But hopefully you guys kind of learned something from this. I will post the link down to the, I will post a link down in the description below with this cheat sheet for week 1 for DFS. So if you guys are interested in that, definitely take a look at that. Like I mentioned before, we'll try to have it on the Patreon for the coming weeks though. So if you're interested in that, very small donation a month, and the XFL is 10 weeks long. So by the time you add it all up, it's just over $10. So could make some pretty good money, especially week one where we don't really know as much, trying to take a little bit more advantage over some of these other people that are just entering it and just being like, oh, well, I know Josh Gordon, I know this guy, blah, 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 blah. So familiar names, but just trying to talk about that in general. As I mentioned before, Friday will be a little bit more interesting. It probably won't be as lengthy of a video. I know this one got pretty elongated just because I was talking about, a lot of these players, a lot of these coaches, and kind of in general. Friday will be a little bit more cut and dry. Talking just DFS perspective, we'll get over to DraftKings, maybe even build a couple lineups with that as well. But that's pretty much what I have for today. XFL preview headed into week one. First look at DFS, kind of my thoughts around these teams altogether, but do appreciate anybody that did take the time out of their day to tune in, whether you were watching on live with the live stream or on replay. And if you guys have any questions related to if you guys have any questions related to the XFL DFS, would be more than happy to answer those questions because it's a very interesting season. I hope the XFL is exciting as it was the last time around. But with that being said, if you are someone that does enjoy my content, you're not already subscribed, feel free to do so. Definitely helps grow the channel that we're trying to build here at Coach Craig Sports. Talking some NBA DFS, talking some XFL DFS, talking some NBA prize picks. Mainly those get up on Twitter for the prize picks. Might do some XFL prize picks in the coming weeks as well. A little bit riskier week one since we don't know quite as much if they are up on prize picks as well. And then as we get closer to the NFL draft, we'll be doing some NFL draft coverage and content for that as well. But with that being said, that's really all I have for today for this video, for this live stream. Do appreciate anybody that did take the time out of their day to tune in, whether you're watching live or on replay. Definitely means a lot to me, and I hope each and every one of you has a great rest of your day.